The email I can't unread. There's one line in one email that I genuinely wish I had never seen. I remember the night clearly. It was late, the kind of late where the building is empty and the only sound is the air conditioning humming through the vents. I was sitting alone in a secure room, staring at a laptop that was never supposed to leave that table, scrolling through yet another chain of emails connected to Jeffrey Epstein. I'd already been at it for hours. Names, dates, attachments, forwards, CCs, all blurring together into a gray wall of text. And then I hit that line. It wasn't graphic. It wasn't some explicit confession. That's what made it worse. It was a casual, almost throwaway sentence buried in the middle of a thread about flights and meetings and donors. A single reference to the young one in between hotel confirmations and dinner plans, written like everyone on the chain knew exactly who that meant, and no one felt the need to clarify. My stomach actually dropped. I pushed my chair back, just a little, like I'd been physically shoved. I've read horrible things in my career. I've sat through testimony that would make most people leave the room. I've seen photos that I still wish I could scrub from my memory. But this was different because it wasn't the language of a monster bragging. It was the language of normal people who had decided that this was just part of how the world works. That's what keeps me up at night. Not just what Epstein did. Not just what we already think we know from the headlines and documentaries. It's how people around him talked. The tone. The familiarity. The way exploitation was woven into the logistics of power, as routine as booking a car service or ordering room service. There is no screaming in these emails. No mustache-twirling villain. Just adults, some extremely powerful, moving money and bodies around a globe like pieces on a board. Let me walk you through what that means. When you spend years dealing with high-profile investigations, you learn to filter. Most emails are noise, scheduling, small talk, the usual egos and anxieties. But every once in a while, something cuts through. A phrase, a pattern, a joke that isn't really a joke. That one line about the young one wasn't just someone being creepy. It was a glimpse into an entire ecosystem that had learned to normalize the abnormal. Here's what really scares me. Most people think the Epstein story is about one man's depravity. A single predator with money, access, and a private island. But when you sit with these emails, when you read them in sequence, you realize that the far more disturbing story is about everyone else. The pilots, the staff, the PR people, the lawyers, the donors, the politicians, the professors, the socialites, all orbiting the same sun, all pretending not to feel the heat. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a group email between a billionaire, a former official, a media executive, and a fixer. They're talking about a charity event, some big-ticket gala that looks noble on the outside. They're confirming who's at which table, which celebrity is willing to show up, which donor wants a photo with whom. And in the middle of it, someone slides in a reference to a few girls coming later. Or you like this one, she's very young, very sweet, followed by a smiley face. Nobody objects. Nobody says, what do you mean by that? Nobody asks, how old is she? The thread just continues, as if they were talking about dessert. That's the world these emails reveal. Not just crime, but culture. A culture where power inoculates people from moral shock. A culture where the question isn't, is this right, but could this leak? A culture where the worst night of a young girl's life appears in someone else's inbox as a logistical detail. And here's the part that should matter to you, not as a spectator, but as a citizen. Because when people like this are the ones writing the checks, making the calls, shaping universities, funding think tanks, talking privately with elected officials, their values leak into the system. Their habits shape who gets hired, who gets silenced, which stories are told, and which ones are buried. If this is how they talk when they think no one will ever read it, what does that tell you about the decisions they're making when the cameras are off? Most people don't realize what just surfaced in these emails. They see headlines about new documents and maybe a few redacted screenshots on social media. But they don't see the texture. The way it feels to scroll through hundreds of messages where humans are reduced to code words and innuendo. The way certain names keep appearing in CC lines like background radiation. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. In the next, I want to explain who I am, why I had access to these documents at all, and how I learned to separate rumor from evidence in cases like this. But before we get there, I need you to understand one thing. This isn't just a scandal. It's a warning. Because if we don't learn from what these emails really show, not just about Epstein, but about the people who enabled him, then the next version of this story won't just be possible. It'll already be in someone's inbox, waiting to be opened. Why you should listen to me. Before we go any further, I owe you something, an explanation of who I am and why I'm even in a position to talk about this. I'm not a YouTuber who stumbled onto a conspiracy thread at 3 in the morning. I didn't get these ideas from a forum or a comment section. For years, my professional life revolved around what people with power say and do when they think nobody will ever see it. My job has been to sit in the rooms where the public's trust is dissected like a specimen, in courtrooms, in secure conference rooms, in closed-door hearings where the microphones are off and the cameras are banned. I've worked around high-profile investigations that never made cable news, and a few that blew up so big you couldn't turn on a screen without seeing them. Some of that was on the inside of government, some as an investigator and later as an analyst brought in to help unpack complex evidence. Emails, financial records, memos, drafts of speeches that never got delivered. I'm not going to pretend I was the star of the show. I wasn't. But I was in the building when decisions were made that shaped headlines you remember. Let me walk you through what that actually means on a day-to-day level. It means long hours in rooms that don't have windows, squinting at monitors or stacks of printed emails. It means learning how to read between the lines, noticing who CC'd, who suddenly disappears from a chain, when the tone shifts after a phone call you never hear but can feel trailing behind the text. It means you stop taking official narratives at face value because you've seen the draft versions where the mess is still visible. You start to understand that power doesn't just live in speeches and press conferences. It lives in the quiet, boring admin work. The calendar invites. The can you jump on a quick call messages. The per our conversation follow-ups. That's where people tell the truth they'd never say on television. I remember one case in particular, not Epstein, but similar in structure. Wealthy man, complicated network, allegations of abuse that everyone insisted were unfounded and politically motivated. For months, investigators combed through his public profile and found nothing that stuck. The narrative was leaning his way. Then someone on the team, a young analyst who didn't have any titles next to her name, pulled an overlooked email thread out of a huge batch that had been sitting in a digital archive. It looked mundane. A staffer confirming travel. A hotel booking. A note about an event. And then, in the middle of that, a strange phrase. A nickname that matched something a survivor had mentioned in her testimony, a detail everybody had quietly dismissed as too vague to matter. That little detail cracked the whole thing open. Suddenly, other pieces started clicking, different witnesses who'd never met using the same word, the same pattern of dates, the same types of locations. That email thread, the one nobody noticed at first, became a centerpiece of the case. Careers changed because of it. So did lives. That's the sort of thing I mean when I say I've seen how fragile the line is between nothing to see here, and this is a scandal that will define a generation. So when I tell you that the Epstein emails, the ones that have surfaced recently and the ones still trickling out through court filings and document releases, feel familiar to me, that's not a casual observation. It's the sick feeling of déjà vu you get when you've watched this movie too many times in different costumes. Now, I need to be clear about something else too. There are hard limits on what I can say about specific documents, especially when it comes to anything that's still sealed, redacted, or under legal dispute. I'm not here to violate court orders, name protected individuals, or pretend I have top secret access I don't. Most of what I'm talking about is grounded in what's already publicly acknowledged. Court records, investigative reporting, official statements, document dumps that journalists and lawyers have fought tooth and nail to pry into the daylight. What I'm adding isn't secret files. It's context. It's the trained eye you develop after reading thousands of these things and learning the difference between a meaningless aside and a red flag that should make you stop cold. Most people, understandably, don't have time to read through hundreds of pages of correspondence. They see a screenshot of one or two lines on social media and a name circled in red, and that's it. But when you go line by line, thread by thread, viewing the emails as a living ecosystem rather than isolated fragments, you start to notice patterns. Who is constantly asking for introductions, who is always grateful for your hospitality, who keeps offering access to friends or girls or models or masseuses in ways that don't sit right. You learn how power talks when it's relaxed. Let me paint you a picture of what that looks like behind closed doors. You're sitting at a long table in a secure briefing room. No phones, no cameras, just thick binders and tired faces. Someone from the legal team is walking you through relevant materials. On the screen, an email pops up, the same style you and I see every day, except the names in the header are people whose signatures can move markets or launch wars. They're talking about donations or a fellowship or a speaking engagement at some prestigious institution. Then one of them references a weekend on a private island, or a fun group staying at a townhouse, or the girls in a way that makes a few people in the room shift in their chairs. You look around and you can tell some have seen this before. Some are seeing it for the first time. Few don't want to see it at all. And then somebody in authority clears their throat and says something like, "Let's focus on what's directly relevant to the investigation." The slide moves on. That line, the one that made your skin crawl, vanishes back into the pile. That dynamic, that subtle act of moving past the uncomfortable parts, is how predators survive inside respectable systems. Here's what really scares me. The Epstein story isn't the first time I've watched institutions flinch away from what their own evidence is telling them. I've sat in meetings where the priorities shifted from, "Is this true?" to "How will this look?" faster than you can blink. I've seen powerful names trigger a different tone in the room, a different level of caution in the language, a quiet recalibration of what counts as enough to act. So when I talk about these emails, I'm not speaking as a distant commentator. I'm speaking as someone who's watched power try to triage its own consciences. I also want you to hear this clearly. I'm not saying that every person whose name appears in or around Epstein's inbox is guilty of a crime. That's not how evidence works, and anyone telling you otherwise is being reckless or dishonest. There are degrees of connection, degrees of knowledge, degrees of culpability. Some people knew exactly what they were part of. Others were orbiting, benefiting from proximity, maybe choosing not to ask questions they should have asked. What I am saying is that the culture visible in these emails is not an isolated anomaly. It's a symptom. And if you've been near enough to that culture, long enough, you recognize the smell. Most viewers never get to see that side of politics and influence. They get the press releases, the polished statements, the carefully crafted denials. I've seen the drafts. I've watched the before and after. I've watched how language gets sanded down until a human nightmare becomes an unfortunate incident, and systemic abuse becomes a series of isolated mistakes. That's why I'm making this video. Not because I enjoy reliving this stuff, I don't. And not because I think I have all the answers, I don't. But because if you only see the Epstein story as one monstrous man and a few bad friends, you will miss the larger, more dangerous truth about how power protects itself. And if there's one thing my career has taught me, it's this: when ordinary people don't understand how that protection works, it will be used against them again and again. So in the next, I'm going to strip away the headlines, the spin, and the sensationalism, and walk you through what actually just surfaced in these emails, what they are, where they came from, and why the details that most people skim past might matter more than the names they recognize. What just surfaced beyond the headlines? Most people have seen the headlines. New Epstein documents released. Court unseals emails. Maybe a blurred screenshot of a name, a couple of lines underlined in red, a breathless tweet thread connecting dots. And then, as quickly as it appears, it disappears into the feed like everything else. What almost no one sees is the thing that actually matters: what these documents are, how they came to light, and what they look like when you read them as a living, breathing record of a world that was never meant for your eyes. Let me walk you through that. These emails didn't just appear out of nowhere because someone suddenly grew a conscience. In cases like this, documents tend to surface through slow, grinding processes that almost no one outside the system pays attention to. Civil lawsuits where victims demand discovery. Criminal cases where prosecutors subpoena records. FOIA requests. Estate disputes. Each one is like a small chisel tapping at the same wall. For years, a lot of this stuff sat buried in court archives, sealed under protective orders, redacted for privacy concerns, or locked up in protracted legal arguments about what the public has a right to see. And those arguments are not always in bad faith. There are real reasons to protect victims in ongoing investigations. But there are also convenient reasons. Convenient for people who would prefer this all stay a footnote. So when you hear a new batch of Epstein emails has surfaced, what that usually means is some combination of judges, lawyers, journalists, and relentless victims finally pried a sliver of this world open. It means a motion to unseal was granted. It means some protective order was narrowed. It means somebody somewhere lost the argument that this would be too embarrassing as a legal shield. But here's what I need you to understand. These are not just calendar invites and itineraries. These are conversations. Long threads that snake through time, across continents, through multiple inboxes and private servers. They include Epstein, of course, and his core circle. But they also touch a much wider orbit. Staffers, assistants, fixers, lawyers, PR consultants, academics, politicians, philanthropists, people whose public image is built on phrases like public service and giving back. And when you read them, you don't just see what they did. You see how they thought. Let me paint you a picture of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Imagine an email chain in 2006. The subject line is something innocuous like dinner next week or foundation event planning. The names at the top are familiar from news stories and magazine covers. One of them is Epstein. Another is a host. Another is a guest of honor, some big name whose presence will make the evening look respectable. There's talk of donations, program schedules, last-minute changes to the guest list. Then, halfway down the chain, someone adds, Jeffrey can bring a few of his girls. They're always such fun. Another replies with a joking, not too young this time, or something equally grotesque disguised as banter. No one pushes back. No one asks the obvious question. The chain keeps going. Back to seating arrangements. Back to sponsors. Back to we're honored you can join us. Now multiply that kind of exchange by hundreds. That's what these new emails give us. Not just the fact of association, but the texture. The effortless way exploitative behavior is threaded into the logistics of high society. You start to see it everywhere. In references to massages, in joking mentions of European models, in vague phrases like, the young friends you brought last time, usually followed by a wink emoji or a lol that reads like a nervous laugh frozen in time. Here's what really scares me. The headlines focus on the biggest names because that's what gets clicks. Look who was on this email with Epstein. Look who he invited. And yes, those names matter. Accountability matters. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper story. Because the real horror isn't just who was in the inbox. It's how normal everyone sounds. They're talking about private jets and research grants and gala tickets and charitable foundations, and then they slide into conversations about girls or masseuses with the same tone they use to talk about the wine list. It's all one world, branded as philanthropy, prestige, intellect, public service, with something rotten swirling just under the surface. Let me give you a sense of how these troves look when you actually sit down to read them in sequence, not as screenshots. At first, it's overwhelming. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages. You see a lot of administrative clutter. Can we move this to 3 p.m.? I'll have my assistant call you. Please see attached. If you're not trained for it, it feels like junk. Then, slowly, patterns emerge. The same names appearing in CC lines. The same locations, an island, a townhouse, a ranch, a private jet's tail number. The same types of requests, introductions to young talent, scholarship candidates, masseuses from Eastern Europe, students who can benefit from mentorship. The euphemisms repeat. The code words repeat. The power dynamics repeat. And after a while, something shifts inside you. You stop seeing isolated emails and start seeing an ecosystem. You stop seeing accidents and start seeing habits. Most people will never go through all of this, and to be honest, I'm not sure they should. It's heavy and it's ugly. But I need you to at least understand what it reveals, that the Epstein story isn't just about one predator working in the shadows. It's about an entire culture that decided, consciously or not, that his money and connections were worth more than the humanity of the girls and young women in his orbit. You see it in the way people talk to him. The flattery, the gratitude. Thank you again for your generosity. You've been such a supporter. We so appreciated your hosting us. Epstein is not treated as a pariah in these messages. He's treated as a patron. Someone whose presence at a dinner is considered an asset. Now imagine being one of the girls whose life he tore apart and seeing that in print. Imagine learning that while you were trying to rebuild your life, while you were wrestling with shame and trauma and lawyers and survival, the man who did this to you was being swapped around email threads as a useful name, a generous donor, a colorful character. Imagine seeing him woven into discussions about education, science, global policy, spaces that are supposed to represent the best of us. That's what I mean when I say these emails are more than evidence. They're a portrait of a moral universe. And what's surfacing now in this latest batch of documents is only part of that portrait. There are still redactions. There are still sealed records. There are still gaps where you can feel something important has been cut out. Whole sections blocked out in black. Names replaced by initials or John Doe. Placeholders where context should be. But even with the gaps, a pattern is visible. Let me walk you through the mechanics for a moment, because this is important. In most of these releases, what the public sees is the result of years of procedural warfare. Defense attorneys arguing that documents are irrelevant or unduly prejudicial. Plaintiffs' lawyers arguing that the public needs to understand the full scope of the abuse. Judges trying, sometimes admirably, sometimes not, to balance privacy, safety, and transparency. That tug of war is why some emails come out now and others don't. It's why some lines are crystal clear and others look like someone took a black marker to reality. And it's why every time a new batch surfaces, you'll hear people on all sides rush to claim it as proof of whatever story they're already telling. What I want you to see is something deeper. This isn't random. These are fragments of a single, ongoing story about how power, money, and secrecy combine to make some people almost untouchable. We've reached the point where, if you're paying attention, you can no longer pretend these are one-off gotcha moments. The emails show consistency in tone, in relationships, and attitudes across years. They show a man who felt confident enough in his protection that he didn't bother to encrypt everything, didn't bother to sanitize his language fully, didn't bother to distance himself from the powerful people who gladly used his hospitality. And they show those powerful people largely unbothered. Here's what really keeps me up at night. This is only what we see when the curtain is accidentally pulled back. If this much casual depravity shows up in written emails, a medium people know can be subpoenaed, printed, leaked. What do you think the conversations look like on private jets, on yachts, in the back rooms of clubs where phones are surrendered at the door? What do you think is being said on encrypted apps that will never see a courtroom? This newly surfaced material matters not just because it names and implicates people, but because it reveals a language, a rhythm, a way of moving through the world. Once you recognize that, you start seeing its shadows in other places, different names, similar patterns. In the next, I'm going to zoom in much closer. I'm going to take you into one specific email thread, one that hit me harder than the rest, and show you, line by line, how something that looks casual can actually be the Rosetta Stone for understanding how this entire ecosystem functioned. Because sometimes it only takes one seemingly small detail to make the whole architecture of denial collapse. And once you've seen that thread, you won't read any of these emails the same way again. The one thread that changed everything for me. There's one thread buried in that mountain of emails that I can't shake. Not the most explosive. Not the one with the biggest name in the subject line. In fact, if you skimmed it quickly, you might not notice anything special at all. It looks like logistical clutter, the kind of thing every assistant in the world deals with: flights, hotels, guest lists, scheduling headaches. But if you slow down, if you really read it, it changes everything. Let me walk you through it. The subject line is something generic. London/NYC schedule, or weekend logistics, something like that. It starts with an assistant confirming Epstein's travel dates, times, first-class seats, car services in 2 different cities. Then another assistant, working for a different powerful figure, jumps in. They're trying to line up diaries. He's available the evening of the 14th. We can move dinner to accommodate. The host would love to see Jeffrey again. So far, it's just admin. Then 3 or 4 emails down, the tone shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way that would scream at you if you were in a rush. Just one line, almost nested in a paragraph about arrivals and hotel suites. Jeffrey will bring the young one, the one from last time. They all adored her. That's it. No name. No age, no context, just the young one, as if that's enough of a descriptor for everyone on that thread to know exactly who we're talking about. I remember the way my eyes stopped on that phrase. It was almost physical. The room was quiet. The glow of the screen felt suddenly harsh. You know the feeling when you're driving and you hit a patch of black ice. Everything looks normal, but your stomach knows something just went very wrong. It was like that. And then the replies come. Great, can't wait, one person writes. Perfect, she was such a delight. Another adds, with a little exclamation point that made my skin crawl. One of them, trying to be cute, says something along the lines of, "Behave yourselves this time, gentlemen," followed by a smiley face. Nobody says, "Who is this?" Nobody says, "How young?" Nobody says, "Is this appropriate?" The thread just rolls on. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not going to name the people on that email, and I'm not going to pretend this single line proves a specific criminal act for every person copied. That's not how evidence works, and that's not what I'm doing here. But you don't need names to understand what's happening inside that thread. What you see is normalization. Later, when I had some distance, I called a psychologist I trust, someone who has worked with survivors of grooming and trafficking. I laid it out in general terms, a group of adults talking about a young one like she's a party favor, everyone understanding the reference, no one objecting. I asked her, what are we really seeing in that kind of exchange? She told me something that has stayed with me ever since. Predators don't just groom victims, she said. They groom environments. Let that sit for a second. They groom the people around them, staff, friends, colleagues, slowly pushing the edge of what's considered normal. A joke here. A comment there. A slightly younger +1 at a dinner, then another, then another. Little by little, the group becomes desensitized. By the time anyone could plausibly say, this is wrong, they're already complicit in their silence. Language plays a central role in that process. Instead of saying a teenage girl, it becomes the young one. Instead of a child, it becomes a model, an intern, a student. The vocabulary gets blurred, deliberately vague. The effect is anesthetic. It dulls the moral nerves. It allows people to look directly at a situation without really seeing it. Let me paint you a picture of that dinner, the one they're planning in that thread. Imagine a long table in a private room at a high-end restaurant in London or New York. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, walls lined with art. The kind of place where the staff know your name before you walk in the door because they've been briefed. Around the table, recognizable faces. A former official. A media figure. A billionaire with a foundation named after him. Maybe a couple of academics whose ideas you've seen quoted in respectable outlets. And then toward the end of the table, the young one. Maybe she's 18 on paper, maybe younger. Maybe she's been told this is an amazing opportunity, that she's being introduced to important people. She's dressed in a way that makes her look older than she feels. She's rehearsed a few lines in her head so she doesn't sound stupid. She laughs a little too hard at jokes she doesn't understand because her survival instinct is screaming, be agreeable. To the men who wrote that email, she's a highlight of the evening. A perk. An amenity that they all adored. To her, it might be one more step down a staircase she doesn't fully see yet. Here's what really scares me. That email thread only works if everyone on it has already been conditioned not to flinch. It only works if the young one is not a red flag but a shared reference point. It only works if the groomed environment is functioning perfectly. When I say that line changed everything for me, I don't mean it gave me a brand new piece of information about Epstein. We already knew from flight logs, from survivor testimony, from plea agreements, that young girls were being brought into his orbit. That's not news. What it gave me was something more unsettling, a window into the souls of the people around him. Because remember, these aren't his private diary entries. This is a group thread. There are assistants on it. There are people with reputations to protect on it. There might be corporate or institutional email addresses on it. And yet, not one person in that chain seems concerned. Not one person opts out. Not one person, at least in that record, demands clarity or sets a boundary. All you see is smooth, mutual understanding. As my psychologist friend put it, by the time it shows up in an email like that, the real grooming work is already done. The test balloon has already been floated. Nobody popped it. So now it becomes part of the script. And that's when I pushed my chair back in that quiet room. Because in that moment, I realized something that I wish I could say was shocking, but really it was confirming an ugly suspicion. This was not just about one man's depravity. It was about the social circles that had trained themselves to treat that depravity as a minor, manageable eccentricity, like being a bit too loud after a few drinks, or having weird political views. Epstein wasn't just tolerated. He was integrated. I've seen versions of this before, in other cases, with other men who surrounded themselves with sycophants and gatekeepers. You start with someone too powerful to challenge easily. You add a group of people who depend on him, from money, access, status, proximity to the inner ring. You mix in a culture that values discretion over truth, networking over conscience, loyalty over ethics. The result is always the same. Behavior that would get an ordinary person arrested becomes, at worst, an awkward joke. In that one email thread, That entire dynamic is visible in miniature. The hierarchy, the roles, the complicity. And here's the part that should worry every single one of us. This isn't just a story about Epstein's friends or his victims. It's a story about any system where power is allowed to rewrite the moral code in real time, where what's obviously wrong becomes complicated, sensitive. Don't put that in writing until the only unforgivable sin is speaking up. When you understand that, the question stops being how did this happen and becomes how many other versions of this are happening right now in different clothes with different names. Because if this is how they talk on email, a medium they know can be subpoenaed, just imagine how they talk in the conversations that leave no trace. In the next, I'm going to pull back from this single thread and show you what happens when you start mapping these exchanges across time and across people. When you follow the CC lines, the introductions, the casual referrals. Because once you see how many rooms are connected by this kind of language, you realize that the Epstein problem is not one bad actor. It's an entire way of doing business. How the elite talk when they think no one's listening. By the time you've read a few thousand of these emails, you start to pick up on something that's hard to explain if you haven't lived inside them. The vocabulary of people who have learned to make ugly things sound harmless. Let me walk you through that language. On the surface, the words look ordinary. Dinner, guests, friends, girls, massages, models, students. There's no cartoon villain monologuing about exploiting minors. That's not how this world talks. Instead, it's all soft edges and euphemisms. You have to read them the way a doctor reads symptoms, not as isolated dots, but as part of a pattern. Take the word massage, for example. In normal life, a massage is something you book at a spa, or through a hotel concierge, or maybe from a licensed therapist you trust. In Epstein's emails, massage shows up again and again, usually in quotes, often attached to phrases like young, new, European, or very sweet. It becomes a code word that sits in this uncanny valley between plausible deniability and obvious intent. Jeffrey would like a massage this evening, same as last time. Can you find a couple of girls for massages? She's very young but very experienced at massage. If you read that once, you might shrug. If you read it 50 times across different threads, different years, different locations, it stops being ambiguous. It becomes part of the grammar of the ecosystem. I sat down once with a linguist who studies how closed groups develop their own coded language, everything from criminal syndicates to corporate cultures. I sent over some anonymized excerpts, stripped of names and identifying details, and asked a simple question. What do you see here that an ordinary person might miss? She pointed out something that sounds obvious once you hear it, but hits hard in this context. In-group language, she said, is less about the specific words and more about who doesn't ask for clarification. In other words, if you say massage and everyone understands you mean we're bringing in underage girls, the problem isn't just the code. It's the fact that the code works. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a middle-aged banker sitting in a first-class lounge, replying to emails on his phone between sips of champagne. He gets a message from Epstein's assistant, just confirming 3 girls available for massages at the townhouse when you arrive. Same arrangement as last month. He doesn't write back. Are they licensed therapists? He doesn't say, how old are they? He writes, perfect, thank you, and maybe tosses in a smiley. Now, if someone confronts him years later, he can say, I thought it was a regular massage. I had no idea. But his behavior in that moment, his failure to ask the questions any normal person would ask, tells a different story. The language allowed him to stay comfortably half-aware. Here's what really scares me. That's the role this language plays. It's not just communication, it's insulation. You see it in the way they talk about girls versus women. Almost no one in these emails writes women. It's girls, like they're talking about a cheerleading squad or some pop band. It infantilizes and sexualizes at the same time. Every time they type it, it nudges the reality 1 inch further away from these are vulnerable human beings toward these are accessories. Then there are the in-jokes. Little things like we'll behave this time, promise, or don't get us in trouble, winky face, sprinkled into threads that, to an outsider, look vaguely flirtatious but not necessarily criminal. Inside the context, after you've mapped out what behave actually meant, those jokes sound more like confessions dressed up in winking sarcasm. I remember one thread where someone said, we don't want another incident like last time, followed by OL. No explanation, no detail. Just that word, incident. Ask yourself, what kind of incident would make grown adults talk in half-coded jokes years later? What kind of thing is serious enough to need euphemism, but not serious enough in their minds to end a relationship? I've watched lawyers and PR people plug themselves into these conversations too, and the shift in language when they arrive is almost clinical. Suddenly you see phrases like for optics and to avoid negative coverage, and this could be misinterpreted. Not this is wrong, not this harms people, but this could look bad. It's like watching a surgeon mask a wound with makeup instead of stitches. Let me walk you through how that works in practice. An email thread starts with travel and girls. Someone jokes too openly. Someone else replies in a way that's a bit too on the nose. A third party, maybe a lawyer, maybe a PR advisor, gets looped in later when things feel fragile. Their response doesn't express moral horror. It's about risk management. Going forward, please avoid specific references to ages in writing. Let's be careful using the word girls in official communication. Best to keep detailed arrangements off email. The problem isn't that they suddenly discovered a conscience. The problem is that they discovered exposure. I remember sitting in a debrief with a former federal prosecutor who'd handled organized crime. We were talking about this kind of language, and he said something I'll never forget. When the lawyers show up and the only thing that changes is the wording, not the behavior, you're not fixing a crime. You're upgrading the software. In other words, the system gets smarter. The code gets cleaner. The exploitation doesn't stop. It just goes further underground. Here's another pattern that caught my eye: the constant blurring of roles. You'll see a girl described as a student, then in another email as a model, then as a masseuse, then as a friend of Jeffrey's. In some cases, these may all be technically true. She might be a student who also modeled. But linguistically, something else is happening. The shifting labels make it harder to pin her to a specific, protected category. If she's a student, then certain rules apply. If she's a worker, different rules apply. If she's a guest, fewer rules apply. By constantly changing the noun, they keep her on the edge of definition, which is exactly where predators like their victims, hard to categorize, easy to rationalize. Now imagine being that girl, watching a world of adult power talk about you through terms that make you sound interchangeable. Most people will never read these emails, but they will hear the sanitized language that trickles out from the same mindset: regrettable associations, inappropriate relationships, poor judgment, crossed boundaries. These are the phrases elite culture uses in public to avoid saying words like abuse, coercion, exploitation, rape. What I see in the Epstein emails is the private version of that same linguistic game. On the inside, it's more casual, more vulgar, more explicit in its entitlement. On the outside, it's polished and rehearsed, tuned by publicists and crisis managers. But the moral core is the same: protect the system, minimize the harm, blur the truth until it feels negotiable. Here's what really scares me: words don't just describe reality in these circles. They create it. If enough people in a powerful room agree that something is just a misunderstanding, it will be treated as such, even if, on the ground, it's a crime scene. If enough leaders in a prestigious institution decide that a repeated pattern of abuse is a series of isolated incidents, the institution will act accordingly: quiet settlements, quiet transfers, quiet statements about moving forward. The Epstein emails read like a rough draft of that process in motion. We see the jokes, the euphemisms, the strategic vagueness, and then at later dates, we see the fallout: lawyers arguing that certain phrases don't really mean what they look like they mean, that there's no clear evidence of criminal intent. But when you've watched the language evolve from the inside, that argument rings hollow. The words were doing their job all along, giving everyone just enough cover to keep going. Let me paint one last scene for you. Picture a luxury hotel suite late at night. City lights outside the window. The room smells like expensive cologne and spilled wine. A man you've seen on television is sitting on a couch, loose and tie, scrolling through his phone. He opens his email and sees a message: "Had a wonderful evening. The girls were fantastic as always. Jeff send his regards." He grins, types back something like, "Always a pleasure," and hits send. That one moment, that tiny flick of his thumb on a touch screen, doesn't make headlines. But it's one more data point in a system where language functions like a laundering machine. Dirty actions go in, softened words come out. And if we don't learn to read those words for what they really are, we will keep getting fooled by the same playbook. In the next, I want to shift from what they say to who is saying it and who is quietly copied in the background. Because once you stop looking only at the from line and start paying attention to the CC, you realize the real story isn't just in what's written. It's in who's being included, who's being kept in the loop, and who has been silently nodding along the entire time. The web of names power in the CC line. There's a moment when you're deep in these documents where you stop reading the body of the email first and start reading the header. Who sent it? Who it's to? And most of all, who's in CC? Because if the language tells you how they think, the headers tell you who lives in their world. Let me walk you through what that looks like from the inside. In the beginning, when you're first handed a data set like this, you do what everyone does. You scan for the big names. The ones you recognize immediately from the news, from magazine covers, from political campaigns and corporate billboards. Was he on the plane? Was she at the island? Did they email him directly? That's where the media goes, and frankly, that's where your eyes go too. But after a while, something shifts. You start noticing the names that don't show up in headlines but keep showing up in CC lines. The chief of staff, the special assistant, the program director, the fixer whose name never appears on official letterhead but pops up in every tricky situation, the lawyer who's always looped in for awareness, the university liaison who handles VIP donors. They're not always the ones sending the emails. They're not always the ones replying. But they're in the room. They're being kept informed. And that tells you everything. Let me paint you a picture. You're looking at a thread about a private dinner hosted at a townhouse owned by someone in Epstein's circle. Subject line, confirmations for Thursday. The visible names are the usual suspects: Epstein, a prominent businessman, a former official, a couple of philanthropists. They're coordinating details, arrival times, dietary restrictions, security arrangements. But your eye slides over to the right. There, quietly listed in small font, is the dean's assistant from a prestigious university, a PR person from a major media outlet, a representative from a foundation handling youth programs. None of them say much in the thread. Maybe a received thank you, or we'll arrange car service. They're background characters. Until you realize these background characters are the ones who move the machinery that made Epstein respectable. I remember one specific sequence where Epstein was arranging a visit to a campus, not as a student, obviously, but as a donor and friend of the institution. The emails included a university development officer, a department head, and someone from the president's office. Epstein's name was treated like a gift. We're delighted Jeffrey is willing to support this initiative. Can we put together a list of faculty for him to meet? And then quietly CC'd on that same chain, a staffer from his team known in other threads for coordinating massages and company wherever he traveled. Nobody questioned why that person needed to be in the loop for a campus visit. Here's what really scares me. The CC line is where you see how many different spheres of society were connected through this one person. Academia, finance, politics, media, charity, science. You start mapping it out, and suddenly the story stops being Epstein and a couple of friends and becomes Epstein as a hub in a much larger network of mutually reinforcing power. I want to be careful here, because this is where bad faith actors love to jump in and scream, everyone is guilty. That's not what I'm saying. Being CC'd on an email doesn't make you a co-conspirator. It doesn't prove knowledge of crimes. There are people in these threads who were clearly there for legitimate reasons: scheduling, logistics, security. There are people whose connection is superficial, transactional, accidental. If you've ever worked near a powerful person, you know that your inbox fills up with things you never asked to see. But here's the key distinction. There's a difference between being near the smoke and feeding the fire. And the more these threads you read, the easier it becomes to tell who is doing which. For example, you see certain names that only appear when money is being discussed: wiring instructions, foundation grants, donor recognition opportunities. Those people belong to the financial circulatory system. They're the ones making sure Epstein's money flows into institutions that then lend him moral cover. He funds our research. He supports our students. He's a valued partner. Then there are the social conduits, the people who always seem to be making introductions. Jeffrey, meet X. I think you get along with Y. Could you host Z at your place this summer? They show up whenever a new person is being pulled into the orbit. Sometimes they're socialites. Sometimes they're consultants. Sometimes there are other wealthy men who see Epstein as a useful connector. And then, of course, there are the ones who appear in both types of threads, talking about donations in one email, girls, and massages in another. That overlap is where the network becomes visible. Let me walk you through a hypothetical that's not really hypothetical. It's a composite drawn from patterns I've seen, in this case and others. A billionaire wants access to certain political or academic circles. Epstein, already embedded in those circles, becomes the bridge. Emails fly back and forth. Delighted to introduce. Jeffrey has been such a supporter of our work. We'd be honored if you join us at his home for a small gathering. On those threads, you see university officials, foundation heads, maybe a senator or two. On separate threads, often with overlapping names, Epstein's team is arranging company, massage therapists, young models for that same weekend. The same dates, the same locations, different language. Not everyone sees both sides, but some people do. And when you trace who is consistently present on both types of communication, who's in the CC line for the donor gala and the massages, you start to see not just individuals but roles. The go-betweens, the brokers, the people who specialized in making sure money, access, and flesh moved efficiently through the system. Here's something that doesn't show up in headlines but hits you hard when you work through this stuff at scale. How rarely anyone really leaves. People cycle in and out. A name appears heavily in the mid-2000s, then less often later. Some get spooked. Some get caught up in their own scandals and drop away. Some die. But the overall structure, the idea that there is a class of people who share jets, islands, think tanks, and young friends, endures. When one node disappears, another takes its place. It reminded me of something an intelligence officer once told me when we were discussing organized crime. You don't just track individuals. You track roles. People wear the role like a jacket. When they fall, someone else picks it up. When you look at these emails through that lens, the CC lines become something like an X-ray of elite culture. You see who always needs to be informed, who is always invited, who is never, ever surprised. You also see an interesting category of name, people who only appear in forward chains. Somebody sends them a selection of messages with a short note at the top, like, FYI, look at who came by Jeffrey's place last week, or thought you want to see who we had at dinner. These forwards are like little status postcards. They say, I am close enough to this world to give you a peek behind the curtain. When your social currency is proximity to power, forwarding an email with 4 famous names in the header is like flashing a VIP wristband. Most ordinary citizens will never see themselves in these threads. They don't know anyone who casually CCs a former head of state or a billionaire hedge fund manager. But decisions made in these networks ripple outward. A donation to a university affects what kind of research gets funded. An introduction to a politician affects what policies get drafted. A favor for a media executive affects which stories get buried or inflated. That's why this matters for you, sitting far outside that world. Because when you vote, when you send your kid to college, when you trust an institution not to be corrupt, you're trusting that the people in those CC lines are operating under some kind of moral law, not just an etiquette code for the wealthy. Here's what really scares me. Once you see how easy it was for someone like Epstein to become a central node in that web, you realize how vulnerable our systems are to anyone willing to mix philanthropy, flattery, and exploitation in the right proportions. He wasn't a president. He wasn't a CEO of a global tech company. He wasn't the head of a major religion. He was, in the grand scheme of things, a moderately successful financier with a knack for making powerful people feel important. And yet his name threads through institutions that shape education, science, media, and politics. Ask yourself, if someone like that could weave himself into the fabric of so many worlds, what does that say about the fabric itself? In the next, we're going to look at something that's even more disturbing than who appears in these emails, who doesn't speak up. Because if the CC lines show you who knew enough to be included, the silence that follows shows you who chose to do nothing, and how that quiet, passive complicity is the oxygen that keeps systems like this alive. The dog that hasn't barked, complicity by silence. There's a phrase I stumbled across in one of these email chains that stopped me cold. It wasn't about girls or massages or any of the obvious tells. It was this. He's a dog that hasn't barked. That line was written about a man whose name you would recognize instantly. A man with real influence, the kind of influence that makes people choose their words very carefully. The context was a back and forth about who might pose a risk if things started to unravel around Epstein, who might talk, who might turn, who might decide that self-preservation was more important than loyalty. One of Epstein's associates was reassuring another. This particular person, they said, was a dog that hasn't barked. If you've spent time in certain corners of law enforcement or intelligence, you know that phrase. It's a reference to a Sherlock Holmes story where the key clue isn't what the dog did, but what it didn't do. The guard dog didn't bark when the intruder came. Why? Because the dog recognized him. Silence became evidence. Let me walk you through why that line matters so much. In that email, they weren't praising this man's integrity. They weren't saying he didn't bark because there was nothing to bark about. They were praising his silence, his willingness not to react, not to expose, not to distance himself, despite everything he must have known or suspected. Silence is a service. Silence is currency. After I read that line, I reached out to a former prosecutor. I know someone who has handled organized crime and public corruption cases. I asked him, when you see language like that, a dog that hasn't barked, what do you hear? He didn't hesitate. It means they've tested his boundaries, he said. They've already given him something he could have spoken up about, and he didn't. He passed the test. From then on, his silence is part of the structure. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a man who's been in Epstein's orbit long enough to see more than he should. He's been to the townhouse, the island, the ranch. He's seen the young ones at dinner, the endless stream of students and models and massage therapists. Maybe he doesn't know every detail, but he knows enough that any normal person would be deeply alarmed. And what has he done with that knowledge? Nothing. He still takes the calls. He still answers the emails. He still shows up for the dinners. He still forwards Epstein's introductions to other powerful friends. On paper, there's no record of him objecting. No record of him warning anyone. No record of him cutting ties with an explanation that could be used later as corroboration. From the perspective of the people inside this system, that makes him valuable. Here's what really scares me. The way these emails talk about silence makes it clear that it's not an accident. It's managed. It's monitored. It's rewarded. You see threads where they discuss who needs reassuring. Someone is nervous because of a news story, or because a lawsuit has surfaced, or because a law enforcement inquiry has knocked on a few doors. There's a flurry of messages. He's nervous. She's asking questions. We need to calm X down. Then later, another update spoke to him. He's fine. He won't say anything. Another dog that hasn't barked. In one exchange, someone even asks, more or less, what about name? Could he become a problem? The response is a casual dismissal. No, he's enjoyed the hospitality too much. The implication is clear. Shared guilt is insurance. Once someone has taken enough from the system, they're less likely to expose it, because exposing it means exposing themselves. I showed some of this to a retired intelligence officer who'd worked in counterintelligence, the world where you worry about moles, leaks, people flipping under pressure. He said something that hit me hard. Every network has pressure points. But the most dangerous people aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes the most valuable asset is the person who sits in the middle of everything and never makes a sound. Think about that. We tend to imagine conspiracies as rooms full of people talking, plotting, whispering. But in reality, a lot of the most important work is done through silence. Not calling a reporter. Not calling the police. Not returning the victim's calls. Not responding to the staffer who's uncomfortable. Not asking follow-up questions in that email where the young one is mentioned by name. Silence is the decision. Let me walk you through a scenario I've seen play out more than once in different contexts. A junior staffer notices something is off. Maybe she sees Epstein at a university function and watches him leave with someone who looks far too young. Maybe she books a flight for a companion whose details don't add up. She goes to her boss and says, "This feels wrong." The boss nods, thanks her, tells her she was right to bring it up. And then nothing. No investigation. No internal alarms. Maybe if she's lucky, something low-key happens behind the scenes, a quiet request that Epstein not bring guests like that anymore. More likely, the concern gets reframed as a misunderstanding, or her perception is chalked up to inexperience. Over time, she learns the lesson. In this ecosystem, barking is a career risk. Pretty soon, she becomes another dog that doesn't bark. Here's where I'm going to say something uncomfortable. This dynamic doesn't just exist in elite circles. It exists with us too, the broader public. Think about how many times, over the years, stories about Epstein or people like him cross the news cycle. Weird billionaire with private island. Mysterious plea deal. Odd friendship with famous person. Flight logs published. Victims speaking out. Some of that made headlines. Some of it turned into jokes. Some of it was dismissed as conspiracy. How many times did we shrug, scroll past, move on? I include myself in that. There were moments before I ever sat in that room reading these emails when I saw enough to know something was deeply wrong, and I kept going with my day. I told myself I was busy. I told myself the system would handle it. I told myself that one more scandal didn't matter in a world already drowning in them. In my own way, I was another dog that hadn't barked. Now imagine, really imagine, different timeline. Now imagine that 10, 15 years ago, some of the people at the center of these email chains had done what they should have done. Imagine a university president who said, "No, we are not taking this man's money, and here's why." Imagine a banker who escalated suspicious transactions loudly and publicly instead of quietly filing a form and moving on. Imagine a staffer who refused to keep booking flights after what she saw and went to the press instead. Now imagine that when those first stories surfaced about underage girls, about sweetheart plea deals, about suspicious plea agreements, we as a public treated them not like gossip, but like alarms. Imagine that instead of slotting Epstein into the same mental category as bizarre rich guy with weird friends, we recognize him as a test case of how much depravity wealth can shield. How many girls wouldn't have met him after that? How many lives would have taken different paths? How many young ones would never have been reduced to a casual line in an email? We'll never know the exact number. But we can be sure of one thing. It would not be zero. Here's what really scares me. The people in these emails knew exactly how much they were relying on silence to survive. They weren't just counting on lawyers and PR. They were counting on us, on the media getting bored, on the voters being distracted, on the public having a short memory and a high tolerance for disgust. They were counting on a world of dogs that don't bark. I'm not saying every citizen is to blame for Epstein. That would be absurd and unfair. Responsibility lies primarily with the people who committed the crimes and the institutions that protected them. But I'm saying that systems like this flourish in environments where outrage is short-lived and attention is easily redirected. Silence isn't always complicity. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's the survival instinct of people who feel too small to challenge something so big. But from the perspective of someone like Epstein, all forms of silence are equal. Whether you're a powerful man in his inner circle who knows and says nothing, or a mid-level official who suspects and says nothing, or a public who sees the headlines and demands nothing, the effect is the same. Nothing happens. And he keeps going. In the next, I'm going to show you how, even when the system did catch glimpses of what was happening, through banks, hotels, security logs, internal reports, those glimpses were often filed away, minimized, or pushed down the bureaucratic chain until they lost their urgency. Because once you understand how silence works at the individual level, the next step is seeing how institutions, as a whole, can be trained not to bark either. The system saw pieces of this and looked away. Up to this point, we've been talking about individuals, the people who wrote the emails, laughed at the jokes, stayed quiet when they should have spoken. But there's another layer you only really appreciate when you've sat inside the machinery itself, the system. Because here's the hard truth most people don't want to hear. The system saw pieces of Epstein. Not the whole picture. Not the island and the flight logs and the full horror. But pieces. Enough pieces that, stitched together, could have formed a picture years earlier. And it looked away. Let me walk you through how that happens in the real world. We like to imagine that if a bank sees suspicious transactions, it slams on the brakes. If a hotel notices disturbing patterns in bookings, it calls the police. If private security logs something that feels wrong, the alarm gets pulled. We tell ourselves that there are adults in the room, compliance officers, managers, regulators, whose job is to step in when something crosses a line. And sometimes they do. But more often than most people realize, what actually happens is quieter, slower, more bureaucratic. A red flag gets turned into a yellow flag, then into a note, then into a file, then into a statistic on a report nobody reads. I've watched it happen. Imagine a bank. Not a cartoon bad guy bank, just a big, global, very normal institution. Somewhere in that bank, there's a department called compliance. Their job is to monitor transactions for things like money laundering, fraud, sanctions violations. They work with algorithms, risk scores, thresholds. When something looks off, a case gets opened. One day, a junior analyst notices that an account linked to Jeffrey Epstein is moving money in ways that don't quite make sense. Frequent cash withdrawals, transfers to individuals with no obvious business relationship, payments to consultants in jurisdictions known for shell companies. Nothing that screams crime on its own, but weird. Weird enough to feel wrong. The analyst flags it, fills out a report, kicks it up the chain. Now, on paper, the system has done its job. A suspicious activity report is generated. Maybe it gets sent to a regulator. Maybe it gets logged internally. Maybe someone schedules a meeting. Here's where the subtle part begins. A supervisor looks at the name on the account, recognizes it. This isn't a random guy. This is someone with relationships, with lawyers, with a history. Maybe the bank has made a lot of money off his business. Maybe he's been a valued client for years. Suddenly, the question shifts from, is this suspicious, to how sensitive is this? The supervisor calls their manager. They have a meeting in a glass-walled conference room. They talk not just about the numbers, but about reputational risk. They talk about how calling law enforcement aggressively could blow back on the bank if they're wrong. They talk about how important it is to handle this carefully. At the end of that conversation, what started as a gut-level alarm in a junior analyst's stomach becomes a paragraph in a report, softened by phrases like potential concern and requires monitoring. Nobody tears up the report. Nobody commits an obvious crime by hiding it. They just let it drift into the slow lane. Here's what really scares me. That's usually enough to kill urgency. I've seen versions of this outside of finance too. Hotels and resorts have security teams. They log incidents, noise complaints, medical calls, unusual guest behavior. When a wealthy repeat guest like Epstein rolls in with a group of much younger women or girls, someone notices. A front desk worker or a housekeeper or a security guard has a moment of, this doesn't feel right. Maybe they write it down. Maybe they tell a supervisor. Maybe a quiet note gets added to an internal file, guest frequently accompanied by younger companions. Not illegal, technically. Not enough to refuse service without triggering a legal nightmare. So it sits. Let me paint you a picture from a conversation I once had with a hotel security manager, not about Epstein specifically, but about this class of guest. He told me, our unofficial rule was simple. If they're rich enough, your job is to make problems go away, not create new ones. Think about that. If a poor guest brings in someone who looks underage or intoxicated, suddenly everyone's on high alert. If a billionaire does it, the reflex is different. People second-guess their own instincts. Maybe I'm misjudging. Maybe she's older than she looks. It's not my business. Then they remember whose name is on the VIP list and decide, consciously or not, to move on. The security logs are there. The unusual patterns are there. The system has seen a piece, but nobody sticks it to the other pieces. Let me walk you through a hypothetical that's built from real patterns investigators have discussed publicly. A bank files a suspicious activity report on Epstein's transactions. Somewhere else, a local police department closes out a case after a questionable plea deal. A hospital notes a young woman with injuries and a vague story about an older man, but she doesn't want to press charges. A school counselor hears rumors about a sponsor with a private plane. A hotel logs repeated visits from the same man with different girlfriend who look like teenagers. Each one of those institutions sees a fragment. None of them are tasked with seeing the whole. You like to think this is where law enforcement comes in like some omniscient force, pulling data from everywhere, connecting the dots. And to be fair, sometimes they do, but they're overloaded too. Thousands of reports, limited manpower, political pressure, priorities tilted toward cases that are easier to prosecute or more visible. I've sat in briefings where law enforcement officials talked about triaging leads. They don't say, ignore the rich guy. Not out loud. What they say is, we have limited resources, we have to focus on clear and present threats, or we can't go on fishing expeditions, or we need stronger probable cause. In abstract, that's reasonable. In practice, it means that people with connections and lawyers and complicated lives get a longer leash than people without. Here's what really scares me. The system is not neutral. On paper, the rules are the same for everyone. In real life, If a 19-year-old from a poor neighborhood starts moving suspicious amounts of cash, he gets a very different response than a billionaire financier with friends in government and academia. One is seen as a likely criminal. The other is seen as a complex client. Same behavior, different narrative, different outcome. I remember a conversation with someone who worked on compliance for a major institution. We were talking about Epstein and similar cases, and she said, the higher up the food chain the name is, the more people feel the need to kick it upstairs. And every time it gets kicked upstairs, it slows down. Slowed down investigations, delayed decisions, softened responses. Those are not neutral events. They are choices. Choices that, over years, can add up to entire lives being sacrificed. Now imagine, for a moment, the alternative. Imagine a system where a suspicious activity report on a well-connected client actually triggers faster scrutiny instead of slower. Where a hotel chain treats VIPs as potential risks to others, not just potential sources of revenue. Where universities vet donors who want access to students with the same rigor they apply to protecting their brand. That world is not impossible. It's just uncomfortable. Because to build it, you have to be willing to admit something that institutions hate admitting, that their past behavior, their past silence, their past reluctance helped enable harm. You have to be willing to look at those security logs, those SARs, those internal memos and say, we saw enough to do more. And we didn't. Instead, what we usually get is something softer. Mistakes were made. Our policies at the time were inadequate. We have since implemented new procedures. It's the institutional version of we're moving on. Let me paint you one last scene. Somewhere out there's a file cabinet, physical or digital, that contains a thin folder on Jeffrey Epstein. It might be in a bank. It might be in a hotel chain. It might be in a university, a law firm, a regulatory agency. In that folder are notes, small incidents, odd patterns, concerns raised and logged. If you read that folder today, knowing what we know now, it would look like a flare in the night. But at the time, it was just one more file. One more minor concern in a pile of bigger fires. One more risk that wasn't quite urgent enough to wake anyone up at 3 a.m. And while that folder sat there, gathering metaphorical dust, real girls were being trafficked, groomed, and abused. That's the part that keeps me up. Because when you strip away the language and the emails and the legal jargon, what you're left with is a brutal equation. Every time the system flinched, every time it chose caution over confrontation, every time it downgraded a red flag to a yellow, someone else paid the price. Not in reputational damage. In actual human years. In the next, I want to pull the camera in tight, away from banks and hotels and institutions, down to a single person. A real human being whose entire existence shows up in these emails as a vague, dehumanizing phrase. Because if we leave this story at the level of systems and institutions, it's too easy to feel detached. We need to talk about what it means to be the young one in an email and a whole shattered life in reality. One line, one life, the victim behind the email. There's a line in one of those threads that still makes my chest tighten every time I think about it. It's not even a full sentence. Just a mention. Can you make sure the blonde gymnast from last week is available again? Jeffrey was very pleased. That's it. No name, no age, no history. Just the blonde gymnast. In the email, she's a logistical detail. A reusable asset. A variable to be plugged into a schedule. When I first read it, I did what you almost have to do to survive in this work. I kept going. I flagged the phrase, made a note, moved on to the next message. It's how you train yourself not to drown. But later, when other pieces started to connect, that line came back and wouldn't leave. Let me walk you through how that happens in real investigations. You almost never get a convenient, complete story in one document. What you get are fragments. A description here, a date there, a nickname over there. Survivors come forward years apart, in different jurisdictions, with different lawyers, different levels of detail. Sometimes they remember too much. Sometimes they remember almost nothing. Then, one day, you're sitting with a pile of testimony and that email in front of you, and something clicks. A young woman tells an investigator about being recruited at a local gym. She mentions that she was a competitive gymnast once, that somebody older told her she had the body rich men like. She remembers being taken to a house, remembers the name of the street, remembers the smell of the hallway more vividly than faces. Trauma does that. It burns in sensory fragments. She says, I remember one of them kept calling me the little gymnast, like I was a party trick. On its own, that detail could be nothing. People misremember. Stories blur. But when an email from the same time frame, in the same city, talks about the blonde gymnast from last week, as if she's a bookable asset, you don't forget that. I want to call her Anna. That's not her real name. And what I'm about to describe isn't one single person's story. It's a composite built from patterns I've seen in survivor accounts, in this case and others. But it's close enough to reality that if you've ever read these statements, you'll recognize the shape. Let me paint you a picture. Anna is 16, maybe 17. She grew up in a town that produced athletes like factories, swimmers, gymnasts, track stars. Her world is school, practice, exhaustion, the constant ache of a body pushed to its limits. She's been told her whole life that she's special, that she has talent, that if she works hard enough, sacrifices enough, something big might happen. Then she gets injured. Not catastrophically, not movie-level drama, just enough to knock her off the path. A torn ligament. A back problem. Suddenly, the scholarships look less certain. The coaches move on to the next girl. The attention dries up. She's left with this body she has built like a machine and no clear purpose for it. That's when someone approaches her. A woman, maybe, or a slightly older girl who seems dazzlingly confident. She says she knows somebody who can help. He's a very important man. He helps girls like us. He can open doors. You're exactly what they're looking for. The pitch is wrapped in flattery and opportunity. Do you want to meet him? You'll make more in one evening than your parents make in a week. When survivors recount these moments, they almost always talk about a feeling of unreality. It's not that they don't sense something is off. It's that, for the first time, someone is telling them they are valuable again. After months or years of feeling discarded, that kind of attention is like a drug. Here's what really scares me. By the time a girl like Anna shows up in an email as the blonde gymnast, the grooming has already done its work. I sat once with a trauma specialist who's worked with sexual abuse survivors for decades, and I asked her about this disconnect. How one person's catastrophic memory can be another person's administrative detail. She said, the brain does something strange under trauma. It can lock onto tiny details, the pattern on a rug, the way someone stirred their coffee, and completely blur the timeline. What's ordinary to the perpetrator becomes unforgettable to the victim, and what's unforgettable to the victim barely registers as unusual to the perpetrator. So Anna remembers the music playing in the car, the way the air conditioning felt too cold, the sound of the elevator up to the townhouse, the way the door closed behind her. She remembers the first time she told herself, this isn't that bad, I can get through this, it's only one time. In the email, that night shows up as last week. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I remember looking at that blonde gymnast line and thinking, this might be the only written proof anywhere that this specific night happened. For her, it's a wound she will carry for the rest of her life. For them, it's a line item in a weekend plan. Let me walk you through what Anna's life might look like 10 years later. She's in her late 20s. Maybe she's bounced from job to job. Maybe she tried college and dropped out. Maybe she has a partner who doesn't understand why she shuts down in certain situations, why she can't stand elevators, why she gets nauseous walking past a certain kind of townhouse or smelling a certain cologne. She might not call it trauma. She might just call it my issues. The trauma specialist I mentioned earlier told me, we see the same patterns again and again. Difficulty with trust, hypervigilance, sudden rage, shame that doesn't match any obvious event, an almost compulsive drive to minimize what happened. It wasn't that bad, other people had it worse. Now contrast that with the tone in the email thread. They all adored her. She was such a delight. Make sure she's available. When you live in that world, the girls are not people. They are experiences. They are part of the entertainment package. They are talked about in the same cadence you'd use for a favorite restaurant or a particularly good bottle of wine. I remember a specific moment in my own work when this hit me like a physical blow. I've been reading survivor statements all morning, page after page of halting testimony, painful detail, the slow, raw process of someone trying to put words to things they've spent years trying not to think about. Then, after lunch, I switched back to a batch of emails from the same time period. On one screen, a girl describing the first time she dissociated, watching herself from outside her own body. On the other, a man writing, Jeffrey says the gymnast was perfect. Can we have her again? The whiplash was nauseating. Here's what really scares me. When the powerful talk this way, they are not just describing reality, they are creating it. Every time they reduce a whole human being to the blonde gymnast, they reinforce a mental model where she is interchangeable, replaceable, one of many. That makes it easier later to forget her altogether. I asked the trauma specialist what it does to a person to know, or to eventually discover, that the worst thing that happened to them exists in someone else's archive only as a cheerful logistical note. She thought for a long moment and said, it confirms their deepest fear that they were never really seen, that they were an object in someone else's story, not a person in their own. That's why, when we talk about these emails, I get angry when the conversation stays at the level of gossip. Look who was on the plane. Look who appears in the CC line. It's not that those things don't matter. They do. But if you stop there, you risk turning real human trauma into a spectator sport. The point of looking at these emails is not to gawk at the famous. It's to recognize the system that made it possible for someone like Anna to become a nameless, recyclable asset in their world. Let me paint you one last picture. It's years later. There's a court case. Documents are unsealed. Somewhere, Anna sees a screenshot online. A friend sends it to her. Is this you? They ask. She squints at the blurry image of an email. The subject line, the date, the phrase, the blonde gymnast from last week. Her stomach drops. Her heart races. She remembers the hallway, the elevator, the sickly sweet smell of the room. And then she realizes this is how they remembered her. If they remembered her at all. One line, one life. In the grand narrative, she will be one of many. One more data point in a scandal. One more pixel in a documentary. Maybe she gets interviewed. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe she never comes forward publicly at all, choosing instead to try to build a life that isn't defined by something these men treated as a night of fun. But every time we look at those emails and see only a blonde gymnast instead of Anna, we are repeating the same violence in softer form. Here's what keeps me in this, even on the days when I seriously consider walking away from this work. Once you've seen how casually a system can erase someone like her, it becomes impossible to pretend that this is just about one man and his crimes. It's about the playbook. Because the truth is, the tactics that turned Anna into that line of text have not vanished with Epstein's death. They've evolved. They've moved online. They've gone digital. The same patterns of grooming, of recruiting, of commodifying vulnerable young people are being run right now. On apps, on platforms, through agencies, through sponsorships, often in ways that are even harder to trace. In the next, I want to talk about that playbook, how the methods we see hinted at in these emails are alive and well in a world of DMs, encrypted chats, and influencer culture. Because if we don't understand that continuity, we risk treating this story as a closed-in history, when, in reality, it's a manual someone else is already using. This isn't just about the past. The playbook is still alive. I want you to understand something that most people really don't want to face. The Epstein emails are not just a record of what happened. They are a record of how it happened. And that how has not gone away. It's evolved. Let me walk you through what I mean. When you read those messages, you start to see a rhythm. Identify vulnerable young people, offer them opportunity and excitement, gradually erode boundaries, then normalize the abuse inside a bubble of money and power. That's the playbook. Massages, mentorship, modeling, scholarships, friends of Jeffrey, different labels, same core tactic. Turn human beings into consumable experiences. Turn the clock forward to right now. Most people breathe a little easier because the man at the center of that web is dead, and some of his closest associates have faced at least a version of justice. They treat that as an ending. But if you talk to the people who work in online safety, human trafficking, and digital exploitation, they will tell you something very different. The tactics we saw hinted at in those emails are now running at industrial scale on your phone. I remember sitting in a small, cramped office with a cybersecurity expert who works with platforms to track grooming and trafficking patterns. No windows, multiple monitors, endless coffee cups. I asked him, when you look at what's happening on encrypted messaging apps or on certain sugar sites, do you see echoes of the Epstein model? He actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the question felt almost naive. Echoes, he said. This is the soundtrack now. Let me paint you a picture. A 15-year-old girl is sitting in her bedroom. She's scrolling through TikTok or Instagram, watching videos of girls a few years older than her living what looks like a dream. Designer bags, rooftop parties, trips to Dubai or Paris or Mykonos, captions like "so blessed" or "manifesting abundance." In the comments, you see it, men offering help, support, sponsorship. Some are obvious creeps. Some are slick. Some pose as agents, talent scouts, brand managers. One of them messages her directly. "Hey, you have such a great look. Have you ever thought about modeling? I work with some clients who would love to feature someone like you. Totally legit, I promise. We pay well. We can change your life." If you strip away the technology, how different is that from the recruiters in Epstein's world offering massages or work or mentorship to girls who needed money, attention, or a way out? Same promise. Different platform. Here's what really scares me. The new infrastructure makes the old playbook more efficient, more scalable, and easier to disguise. In Epstein's day, you had to physically move people around: flights, cars, hotel check-ins, paper trails. Now recruitment can happen purely online. Encryption hides the conversations. Fake accounts blur identities. Money moves through digital wallets, crypto, prepaid cards. Victims might never see the inside of a private jet, but they can still be sold, coerced, weaponized, and discarded through a screen. I spoke with an online safety advocate who tracks grooming networks on social media. She told me the same basic sequence shows up again and again: flattery, opportunity, gift, secrecy. Don't tell your parents. They wouldn't understand. You're more mature than other girls your age. She paused and added, if you replace DM with phone call and influencer party with private dinner, you could overlay a lot of these conversations onto what we know about Epstein's methods. Let me walk you through a modern version of that blonde gymnast email. Instead of an assistant writing, "Can you get the blonde gymnast from last week?" you have someone messaging a handler, "Can you bring that petite blonde from Insta, the one who came last time?" Instead of a flight log, there's a rideshare trip and an Instagram story tagged #VI night. Instead of a townhouse with a staff, it's an Airbnb booked under a shell company with a ring light set up in the corner and cheap champagne on the counter. The girl posts a picture, carefully cropped, heavily filtered, that makes it look like a glamorous night out. Her friends see it. They get jealous. Some of them ask how they can go next time. And somewhere, in a private chat, someone is already sending that screenshot to a man with money, saying, "She's pretty. She's fun. She's young." If you've read enough of the old emails, the cadence is hauntingly familiar. Here's another piece that's gotten worse, not better: the global reach. Epstein's world, as sprawling as it was, still depended on physical circles: Palm Beach, New York, London, certain islands, certain campuses. Today, a predator with a phone and a bit of charm can cast a net from Los Angeles to Lagos to London, recruiting from dozens of countries at once. I asked a specialist in human trafficking, someone who actually works cases, to explain the difference between what they saw 15 years ago and what they see now. She said, the fundamentals are the same: vulnerability, manipulation, coercion. But the speed is different. The volume is different. And the camouflage is better. It's wrapped in lifestyle now, in aesthetics, in the idea that you're a brand before you're even an adult. Think about that for a second. When your entire self-worth is packaged through likes, comments, and follower counts, the man who offers you a shortcut to visibility isn't automatically a red flag. He looks like an opportunity. The playbook counts on that. And it's not just about sex. The same machinery, the same language of access, mentorship, exclusive opportunities, is being used to pull young people into political extremism, financial scams, cult-like groups, and more. The underlying move is always the same: isolate, flatter, reframe exploitation as privilege. That's what I recognized reading through these emails that made my stomach knot up. This isn't just the story of one billionaire's crimes. It's a template for how power interacts with vulnerability in a society that worships status and looks away from the cost. Let me paint you a more explicit thought experiment. Now imagine a man with Epstein's mindset but with a better grasp of technology, 20 years younger, watching this very video. He doesn't need private jets. He doesn't need a recognizable name. He doesn't even need to step into the spotlight. He just needs a network of handlers, a pipeline of vulnerable teens on social platforms, and access to digital payment systems. He can run the entire operation through encrypted apps, burner accounts, and properties rented under fake names. The emails you'd be reading in that world wouldn't be in some seized Outlook archive. They'd be Telegram logs, Signal chats, disappearing DMs, and voice notes that leave no trace. Tell me, how many of those will ever see a courtroom? Here's what really scares me. Our systems, the ones that failed to stop Epstein when the evidence was literally sitting in inboxes, are now trying to keep up with predators who have learned from his mistakes. They learn not to leave obvious paper trails. They learn not to rely on a single point of failure. They learn to diversify platforms, identities, and methods. And let's be brutally honest, we are not catching up fast enough. Online safety teams at big platforms are underfunded and overstretched. Law enforcement is still arguing about jurisdiction and encryption. Legislators barely understand the technology they're supposed to regulate. Meanwhile, teenagers are carrying in their pockets direct pipelines to people who see them the way Epstein's circle saw the blonde gymnast, as a resource. When I talk to experts in this space, one phrase keeps coming up: coordinated grooming at scale. Not one man in one mansion. Networks, fleets of accounts, sophisticated scripts, psychological manipulation refined by B testing and data analytics. You think the playbook is gone? No, it's had a software update. The reason I'm hammering this point is simple. If we treat the Epstein story as a disgusting anomaly from a darker time, we will miss the warning entirely. The warning is not beware of any one man named Jeffrey Epstein. The warning is beware of any system that allows wealth and status to rewrite your moral instincts, online or offline, past or present, because the next iteration may not look like a middle-aged financier with a private island. It might look like a charismatic influencer with 1 million followers, a talent manager who only operates on WhatsApp, a sponsor offering rent money in exchange for no-strings-attached companionship. The patterns are there, if you know how to see them. In the old emails, we see the crude prototype: rich men, private jets, hand-picked victims referred to as girls, and massages. In the new world, it's smoother, more aesthetic, more integrated into everyday digital life. But at its core, it's the same equation: those with power treating those without as disposable. In the next, I want to ask you to follow me into a thought experiment that makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. Now imagine that none of this, not the old emails, not the court documents, not the survivor testimonies, ever saw the light of day. Imagine a world where all of this stayed buried in sealed files and encrypted chats, while the playbook kept running silently in the background. Because if we don't understand what secrecy really protects in cases like this, we're going to keep confusing avoiding scandal with avoiding harm. And those are not the same thing. Now imagine if none of this ever saw daylight. I want you to do something with me that might feel uncomfortable. Now imagine that none of this ever came out. No unsealed documents. No leaked emails. No flight logs on the news. No depositions on the record. No victims getting their day in court. Just a vague memory of a weird rich guy who died in a cell wrapped in rumors and memes and then quietly disappeared from the front page. Let me walk you through that alternate timeline. In that world, the legal fights over Epstein's records go differently. Judges under pressure accept arguments about privacy and irreparable reputational harm to third parties. The state digs in. Powerful lawyers argue that releasing emails would unfairly tar people with guilt by association. Some journalists keep pushing, but key motions are denied. The public never sees the most revealing threads. The banks keep their suspicious activity reports locked away, accessible only to regulators who are already drowning in paperwork. University boards hold closed-door meetings about donations, and after some hand-wringing, quietly decide to keep the money and move on. Internal reviews get written in vague language, lapses in judgment, policy inconsistencies, areas for improvement. Without documents, the story calcifies into something fuzzy. Epstein becomes a campfire tale, not a case study. Didn't he have some island? Wasn't there a prince involved or something? The details blur. The specifics fade. The point gets lost. Here's what really scares me. In that world, the next version of Epstein doesn't just stay possible. He becomes inevitable. Because if the system can bury this, if the worst of it never surfaces, the lesson learned by people in those CC lines is not, we must never let this happen again. We must never let this get out again. Let me paint you a picture of what that looks like 10 years down the line in that alternate timeline. Somewhere in a marble lobby, A young woman is being escorted into a private elevator by a well-dressed assistant. She's been told she's about to meet an important benefactor, a man who funds scholarships, startups, art projects. The assistant reassures her he's very generous. Just be charming. Upstairs, the man waiting for her is not Epstein. Different name, different face, but the structure is the same. He's learned one critical thing from the discreet legal autopsies of Epstein's downfall in that version of reality. Don't leave a trail. No public philanthropy linked directly to his name. Money moves through cutouts and trusts. No written references to young girls or massages. Everything suggestive is said in person or over encrypted calls. Assistants are trained to speak in neutral, HR-safe language. Hosting a guest, arranging a meeting, facilitating an introduction. Without the raw ugliness of those emails as a case study, compliance officers, journalists, and the public have a harder time seeing the pattern. They have less to point to when something feels off. The predators can always say, "You're overreacting." Don't turn this into another conspiracy theory. Let me walk you inside a newsroom in that alternate world. A junior reporter pitches a story. I found some weird overlaps between this wealthy donor, this politician, and a string of young women making similar allegations. An editor, burned by years of nothing burgers and lawsuits, frowns. We don't have the records we had with Epstein, he says. No emails, no flight logs, no deposition transcripts. We can't build this out the same way. It's too risky. Circle back when you have more. Without precedent, there's no template. Without a template, there's no courage. Without courage, there's no story. Now flip it. Imagine the other extreme, the world where everything came out. Not just the batches we've seen so far, carefully litigated, partially redacted. I mean everything, every email, every flight record, every suspicious wire transfer, every sealed deposition, every internal memo from the banks, the universities, the agencies. Names, dates, amounts. Who knew what, when? Who defended him? Who looked away? Who profited? Let me be honest, that world would be chaos. For a while. Universities would face existential crises. Foundations would scramble to explain how so much money came from one man they now claim they barely knew. Politicians would have to answer for meetings they never disclosed. CEOs would be asked why their names appear on guest lists that now read like crime scene logs. You would see a lot of panic statements. I did not know. If I had known, I would have acted differently. My interactions were limited and purely professional. Some of those statements would be true. Many would not. There would be overreach, too. People who were tangentially connected, who genuinely didn't know, would be dragged into the storm. Opportunists would jump in, mixing genuine evidence with wild speculation. Social media would turn into a feeding frenzy. The words guilt by association would trend every day. It would be ugly. It would be unfair in places. It would feel, at times, like the entire upper-tier society was on trial at once. But here's the uncomfortable question. Would that be worse than the alternative we just walked through? Because in that everything comes out scenario, one thing does happen that never happens when secrecy wins. People are forced to choose sides in the daylight. University boards would have to publicly decide whether to strip names from buildings, return donations, or resign. Political parties would have to decide whether to back candidates with documented ties to abuse or cut them loose. Corporate boards would have to choose whether to stand by executives who shared those dinners, those flights, those weekends or not. You'd see realignment. Some institutions would crumble. Some would reform more deeply than any internal task force or review committee would ever have pushed them. Survivors, for once, would watch the powerful squirm instead of the other way around. Here's what really scares me. And it's why this thought experiment matters. Our instinct, as a society, is to prioritize short-term stability over long-term truth. We tell ourselves that too much exposure will erode trust in institutions, as if the erosion comes from the exposure, not from the actions that made exposure necessary. I've been in rooms where that exact language is used. I've watched senior officials argue against releasing documents because the public might lose faith in the system. They really believe they're protecting something valuable. They talk about national security, social cohesion, public confidence. But I want you to consider this. What kind of trust are we really preserving if it's built on ignorance? Now imagine, really imagine, being one of the girls we talked about in the last and hearing that argument. Imagine watching the men who trivialized you as the blonde gymnast get to keep their reputations clean because exposing them might harm public confidence. Imagine knowing that your pain has been weighed against the comfort of people who will never meet you and found expendable. That's what secrecy often protects in cases like this. Not victims, not the integrity of the system. It protects the ability of people who failed, morally, legally, or both, to move on without consequence. Let me walk you through one more scene. Picture a judge at her desk late at night, reading yet another motion about these emails. On one side, lawyers representing victims, arguing that the public deserves to see how deep this went. On the other, lawyers for powerful third parties, arguing that exposing these messages would cause irreparable harm to reputations and families who had nothing to do with the crimes. If she grants the motion to unseal, she knows exactly what will happen. Headlines outrage, maybe a spike in threats, maybe new lawsuits. If she denies it, nothing blows up. The world goes on. Most people never know what was in those lines of text. The pressure is all in one direction. And that's the quiet, relentless force that has kept so much buried in so many cases like this, the path of least disruption. Here's the truth I've learned after years of watching these decisions play out. When we protect ourselves from disruption by burying the full story, we're not actually avoiding a crisis. We're deferring it. We're letting the same patterns rebuild behind closed doors. We're teaching the next generation of predators what the real red lines are. Not moral lines, but PR lines. Don't get caught in a selfie. Don't write certain words in email. Don't donate in your own name. The playbook evolves. The harm continues. The explosion, when it finally comes, is bigger. So we're left with a choice, and I don't pretend it's easy. We can choose the quiet world where less comes out, where institutions are spared humiliation, where scandal is minimized, where the surface looks calm while the same dynamics keep operating underneath. Or we can choose the loud world where more comes out than we're comfortable with, where some innocent people get dragged into messes they don't deserve, where institutions bleed credibility in the short term, but where predators learn that there is, in fact, a real chance that their words, their habits, their networks will be dragged into the light. Most people, if you corner them, will say they want justice and truth, but in practice, when the cost of truth lands close to home, they start reaching for the dimmer switch. This is enough. People don't need to see everything. We have to think about stability. I get it. I really do. Stability matters. But I also know this. The kind of stability that depends on survivors staying silent and evidence staying sealed is not stability. It's a slow, managed decay. In the next, I'm going to talk about the information war that erupts around these emails the moment any part of them surfaces, how political tribes and media machines weaponize fragments of the truth, how disinformation thrives in the gaps secrecy creates, and how, if we're not careful, even genuine revelations can be turned into just another round of partisan ammo. Because exposure by itself isn't enough. If we don't learn how to handle the truth without twisting it, we'll keep oscillating between denial and hysteria. And in that chaos, the people who understand the playbook best will keep getting away. The information war around the emails. The moment any new batch of these emails hits daylight, something very specific happens. It doesn't start in a courtroom. It doesn't start in a newsroom. It starts on someone's phone. A screenshot, a cropped header, a name in a red circle. Then a caption, "Look who was emailing Epstein." Let me walk you through how fast that machine spins up. The documents drop, maybe through a court order, maybe through a public records release, maybe from an investigative outlet publishing what they've been quietly sitting on. Within minutes, political operatives, partisan influencers, and media outlets on both sides of the spectrum are scrolling faster than any investigator ever will, hunting not for patterns, but for trophies. They're looking for their villain. If you're on the right, you're scanning for Democrats, liberal academics, media figures, Hollywood names. If you're on the left, you're hunting for Republicans, conservative donors, right-wing pundits, certain royal connections. The goal isn't to understand the system. It's to weaponize it. I've watched this in real time, sitting at my own desk, reading the same documents, while my feed erupts with dueling outrage. Let me paint you a picture. On one side of the screen, an account with a bald eagle in its bio posts a screenshot of an email with a prominent liberal's name in the header. No context, no explanation of the content, just the name and the implied accusation. Look, they're all in on it. On the other side, an account with a rainbow flag and a resist hashtag does the exact same thing with a conservative figure. Same red circle. Same unspoken accusation. The comments fill up with rage, but not the kind that leads to understanding. It's confirmation rage. I knew it. Of course. They're all pedos. Hang them. Nobody is asking basic questions. What is this email actually about? Who initiated the contact? What year was this? Is this a one-off or part of a pattern? Guilty of a crime? Guilty of proximity? Guilty of cowardice? Those are hard questions. The internet does not like hard questions. Here's what really scares me. The information war around these emails doesn't just distort the truth. It exhausts it. Because after a while, most normal people who don't live online, people who are trying to raise kids and pay rent and stay sane, see the shouting and think, I can't tell what's real anymore, and they check out. And that disengagement is a gift to anyone who wants this story to fade. I remember talking to a journalist friend in the days after one of the document releases. She was frustrated, tired, and angry. We spent months verifying these records, she said. Tracking down dates, cross-checking testimonies, try not to overstate things. And the first thing that happens is a bunch of influencers strip context off and blast out whatever fits their narrative. She paused, then added, half the people attacking us haven't even read the second page of the filing. Let me walk you through what happens inside newsrooms too, because they aren't innocent in this. Editors are watching the same online reaction. They see which clips go viral, which names trend, which angles get engagement. Even in supposedly sober outlets, there's pressure, subtle but constant, to lead with the biggest names, the most scandalous screenshots. Does this implicate anyone recognizable? Becomes an unspoken filter for what gets covered. Stories about the deeper structural questions, how the banks, the universities, the agencies, the prosecutors failed, struggled to get space. Stories about one famous person's name in a newly released email explode like fireworks. It's not that the name shouldn't be reported. Accountability matters. But when the coverage is shaped by what's most explosive instead of what's most revealing, we end up with a funhouse mirror of the truth. Let me paint you another scene. A cable news panel, late evening. 4 boxes on the screen. The host throws up a graphic. New Epstein documents. Underneath, a list of recognizable names. The conversation immediately becomes, which side is more embarrassed? Does this hurt Democrats more or Republicans more? Whose brand takes the bigger hit? You'll hear lines like, well, both sides have people implicated here, so, followed by a sigh of almost relieved cynicism. If everyone's dirty, no one has to change. It becomes a game of moral offsetting. Yes, our guy flew on the plane, but your guy wrote a friendlier email. Here's what really scares me. This framing turns a civilizational failure into a partisan scoreboard. If your main reaction to the exposure of a trafficking network intertwined with institutions of power is, how can I use this to own my political enemies? Then you've already lost sight of the point. And the people who thrive in these shadows know it. I've seen internal communications from powerful circles, not in this case specifically, but with a similar structure, where they talk explicitly about letting the partisans eat each other until a scandal burns itself out. They know the cycle: outrage, memes, counter-outrage, fatigue. By the time serious questions are being asked in public, most people have moved on to the next crisis. Let me walk you through the disinformation side, because that's the part that really poisons the well. Whenever real, documented evidence of something grotesque emerges, it's like blood in the water. Conspiracy entrepreneurs smell an opportunity. They flood the zone with fake lists, doctored screenshots, fabricated whistleblowers claiming every celebrity you've ever heard of was on the island, in the dungeon, part of a satanic ritual. Real names get mixed with fake ones. Real flights get mixed with invented itineraries. Real survivor stories get blended with lurid fantasy. The result is chaos. If you're a serious investigator trying to build a case, that chaos is a nightmare. Witnesses' memories get contaminated by things they read online. Juries come in preloaded with half-truths and myths. The moment you try to correct the record, part of the audience accuses you of covering up for someone. If you're someone who wants to avoid accountability, that chaos is useful. You can point to the wildest conspiracy theory and say, see, it's all crazy. None of these people know what they're talking about. You can use the existence of false accusations to discredit true ones. Every lie thrown into the pool muddies the water just enough to make the whole pool look suspect. I remember asking a former intelligence officer how they deal with this kind of information warfare when it intersects with real cases. He said, "The hardest part isn't finding the truth. It's keeping the truth from being drowned in noise. Here's the tension that keeps me up at night. We absolutely need transparency. We need documents, emails, logs, testimony out in the open. But transparency without literacy, without the ability to interpret, contextualize, and resist manipulation, is a double-edged sword." Let me paint you a third scene, this time from the perspective of an ordinary viewer. You're at home. Your phone buzzes. A friend sends you a screenshot, an email header with a politician you voted for, and the word Epstein in big letters. No context. No content. Just the implication that you are supporting a monster. You feel shock, then shame, then anger. You go online to figure out what happened. You see threads insisting this proves a global satanic ring. You see other threads insisting the whole story is overblown and no one important really knew anything. You see your preferred media outlet downplaying the connection and the other side screaming about it. Who do you believe? If you're like most people, you fall back on your tribe. You believe the sources you've already chosen to trust. The email becomes just one more brick in a wall between us and them. Here's what really scares me. As long as that's how we process revelations like this, nothing fundamental will change. Because the people who sit at the junction of politics, money, and influence understand something basic. As long as they can keep us fighting over whose monster Epstein was, left or right, blue or red, we will never fully confront the reality that he was a symptom of something that doesn't fit neatly on a party ballot. A culture. A hierarchy. A set of unwritten rules about who gets protected, who gets believed, who gets sacrificed. When I talk about the information war around these emails, I'm not just talking about trolls and bots. I'm talking about entire media ecosystems, political organizations, and even academic voices that would rather fold this horror story into their existing narratives than let it force them to question those narratives. It's safer to say, "This proves the other side is evil," than to say, "This proves our shared system is more rotten than we wanted to admit." In that sense, the information war is not just noise. It's a shield. A shield for institutions that don't want a reckoning. A shield for individuals who don't want to explain their proximity to power. A shield for all of us who don't want to admit how long we tolerated rumors, jokes, and whispers because facing them head-on would have been too disruptive. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a difficult task, learning to demand more truth without turning every revelation into a partisan weapon or a conspiratorial circus. Learning to distinguish between proximity and complicity, between rumor and evidence, between a single email and a demonstrated pattern, not to protect the powerful, but to make our accusations sharper, harder to deflect. Because if everything is a scandal, nothing is. If everyone is a predator, no one is accountable. If every exposure is just content, then even the most damning email becomes another meme in the feed. In the next, I want to step out of the noise and ask a harder question. If we were serious, truly serious, about accountability after Epstein, what would that actually look like? Not just one more perp walk or one more documentary, but real changes in law, policy, and culture that make it harder for the next version of this story to unfold. Because the point of seeing clearly isn't just to feel disgust. It's to decide collectively what we're willing to do about it. What real accountability would actually look like. We need to talk about a word that gets thrown around casually and almost never means what people think it means. Accountability. After scandals like this, you hear it everywhere. Politicians promise it. Institutions pledge it. Press releases declare that steps have been taken to ensure accountability. It sounds strong, serious, final. Most of the time, it's theater. A few reputations get burned. A couple of people lose jobs. Maybe one or two end up in handcuffs. A task force is formed. An internal review is published with black bars over the most damning details. And then gradually, everything drifts back to normal. If you've never seen this up close, it can sound cynical when I say that. If you have, it just sounds familiar. Let me walk you through what real accountability would actually look like in a post-Epstein world, the version we have not yet chosen. Start with something painful, money. In almost every email we've talked about so far, money is the lubricant. Donations, grants, consulting fees, honorariums, support for research or programs. Epstein's cash bought him entry to universities, think tanks, charities, foundations, social circles that pride themselves on doing good. Real accountability would mean this. Every institution that took his money, and not just his, But money from people credibly tied to systemic abuse publishes a full accounting. Not vague statements. Line items, dates, amounts, what the money funded, who signed off, who pushed for it, who raised concerns and was ignored. Then they don't just issue an apology. They make restitution. Not to the public, to the people who paid the price. Imagine a university saying, "We took X million dollars from a man now known to have trafficked girls. We used that money to build facilities and fund programs that elevated our status. We are now committing, in perpetuity, an equivalent amount to survivor support, trauma counseling, and independent watchdog work. And here is the mechanism that ensures we can't quietly walk that back when attention shifts." That would sting. Alumni would howl. Donors would threaten to walk. Boards would panic. But that's what accountability looks like when you recognize that you didn't just take tainted money, you helped launder it into prestige. Now let me pivot to law and policy. If you're serious about preventing the next Epstein, you don't just chase one predator. You change the environment they operate in. That means strengthening mandatory reporting laws, not just on paper, but in practice. When a bank files a suspicious activity report about someone like Epstein, there should be a clear, trackable path for what happens next. Who reviews it? What the timeline is? How often reporting agencies follow up? Right now, a lot of this sinks into a swamp of bureaucracy. Real accountability would mean building systems where patterns trigger escalation, not sedation. Multiple reports from different institutions, a bank, a hotel chain, a local police department, should light up like a Christmas tree on someone's dashboard, not sit in separate silos. That requires investment in data sharing, yes, but also in the human side, specialized teams trained to recognize the specific red flags of trafficking and exploitation among the wealthy and connected, not just among the poor and visible. I once sat with a former federal agent who said, "We are very good at catching dumb criminals and very bad at catching sophisticated ones who look respectable." Real accountability would mean admitting that out loud and designing law enforcement tools specifically for the latter. Then there's whistleblower protection. In almost every of this story, you can see shadows of people who might have spoken up and didn't, not always because they were evil or indifferent, but because they were rational. They knew what happens to people who make trouble for the powerful. Real accountability means changing that calculus. Imagine a hotel employee, a bank analyst, a university staffer, looking at a troubling pattern and knowing concretely that there is a safe, independent channel they can go to, one that won't route their complaint right back through the same chain of command that's invested in keeping it quiet. Imagine that they know there's a real chance they'll be protected and even rewarded, not blacklisted and quietly pushed out. That doesn't happen by accident. That takes law, yes, stronger whistleblower protections with teeth, but it also takes cultural backup. Unions that defend members who speak up. Professional associations that make you retaliated against a whistleblower, scarlet letter. Let me walk you into the boardroom, because that's where a lot of this dies. Real accountability would mean boards of directors actually firing people, not just sacrificial mid-level staffers, but senior leaders, not because they were personally on the plane, but because they presided over cultures that enabled this. We have fired CEOs over stock price dips, over offensive tweets, over bad mergers. Imagine a world where boards said, "You ignored multiple red flags about a man whose behavior we now know was predatory. You championed him. You invited him. You defended the relationship. You're done." With names, with explanations, logged, visible, part of the historical record. Is that harsh? Yes, it's supposed to be. Accountability without career consequences is a press release. Now let's talk about something more intense. Signs the order to unseal. They are not heroes in capes. Most of them are exhausted, scared, often punished for what they do. But every time one of them chooses disruption over silence, they tilt the balance a little. Let me paint you one last picture. Somewhere, right now, there is another inbox that will one day become a crime scene. It may belong to a man whose name you know, or someone you've never heard of. It may hold jokes that make your skin crawl, arrangements that read like a translation of these same emails into a new dialect, euphemisms that future investigators will highlight and circle. Nothing I say here can guarantee that inbox is exposed or that the people hurt by it will ever see justice. But here is the one thing we do control. When that email is finally opened, when someone feels that familiar drop in their stomach as they read a line they can't unread, They will be living in a world shaped, in part, by what we chose to do with this moment. Did we shrug and move on because it was too ugly, too complicated, too politically messy? Did we treat it as another entertainment cycle, binge the documentaries, share the memes, and then go back to normal? Or did we let it change something in our laws, in our institutions, in our tolerance for secrecy, in the stories we tell about what success and power look like? That ultimately is the choice. Not left or right, not conspiracy or cover-up, not believe everything or believe nothing. The choice is whether we want to live in a society that trains its dogs not to bark, or one that, when it smells something wrong, refuses to be quiet, no matter how important the intruder claims to be. Because if we keep choosing the first, then the next Epstein isn't a question of if. He's already out there, typing, sending, confident that when the time comes, we'll look away. My hope, my stubborn, maybe irrational hope, is that enough of us are done looking away, and that the next time an email like the one that kept me up at night lands in someone's inbox, they won't just push their chair back in horror. They'll stand up, and they won't sit down until the rest of us have seen what they saw. This is an imagined political thriller story, not a real classified leak or inside intelligence.